I can split it into the two branches. That one line of my experiences is as an editor of our journal, and at the beginning this experience is interesting from the perspective of our national context, because we established this journal 15 years ago from zero, and now we have indexing Scopus and another databases, and it's relatively respectable journal. And the dealing with authors and starting from point that I had negotiated with authors issue per issue and motivate authors for sending. It's not about automatic sending. It was a very interesting experience to me about communication and negotiation with authors and what is necessary to do for successful publication. It's one branch. And second branch, I have a completely different situation in my professional career with publication, because I have started in that time, it was relatively normal in Central and Eastern Europe with monographies, and that's completely unlogical. Start to write with monographies and not with papers. But on the other hand, I had to go back and work more and more with papers, and now I have some of my publications on ResearchGate, and if you are interested in it, you can check it. And for me, sometimes it's very frustrating feedback by editors, and especially experiences like that. I work on the paper with Peter Miller or a very respectable person like him, and we have a feedback that English is very poor, and it was written by him and corrected by him, and because I am first author and I am not from English-speaking country, and I have feedback that I have very poor English, and I have this type of experiences very frequently, and I'm very understand the situation to position of people from non-English speaking countries.
Okay, so I'm David Foxcroft, as I mentioned earlier, and I've been publishing for quite a few years. I forget exactly how many, but I remembered when I did my PhD now, it was just before I was around about 30, so a long time ago. And what's interesting listening to your concerns that you're facing now at your stage of your career is that these don't go away. I still have those concerns about publishing. I still don't know the answers. I still have lots of questions. I still have challenges and frustrations with the peer review process, with editors. I get told that my English is very poor. and often the peer reviewers' comments, I think their English is very poor, and they're telling me that my English is very poor. It's quite a frustrating situation in many ways. I have developed a resilience over time to dealing with these challenges. And even though I've got this resilience, it still hurts when I get a negative peer review, which happens quite a lot, because when you're submitting papers, quite often you get critical comments. And what I do now is I look at them initially, and then I feel dreadful. I feel awful. But I put them away for maybe a week or two, and I don't look at them again. And then I get them out of the drawer, and I look at the comments, and I think, well, actually, they're not that bad. And some of them are quite easy to address, some of them aren't. Sometimes I have to try a different journal, but some of them are quite straightforward. And there seems to be some benefit from having a little bit of separation from reading the peer reviews initially, and then, this is how I cope with it, and then addressing the peer reviews comments. So I cope with a peer review process and with that sort of negative critical feedback that I take quite personally in that sort of way, which for me is quite adaptive. I have published in a range of different journals. Sometimes we go for the very highest journal, and sometimes it's accepted, often it's not, and then we go for some lower journals. And that's a strategy that lots of researchers use. At other times we think that a particular paper suits a journal very, very well. So it's not necessarily the highest ranking journal in the field, but it does have a particular profile, a particular audience that we think is perfect for the paper. So we might target that journal, and that seems to work quite well. Often we will get in touch with the editor and say, we've got an idea for a paper, we'd like to submit it to your journal, what do you think? And sometimes the editors will come back and say, not quite sure, they're a little bit lukewarm. And in those situations, we have a discussion and we may decide to go with a different journal. It's a way of getting some immediate feedback about fit with a particular journal that avoids the 6-month delay that would happen with submitting, waiting for peer reviews, and then getting the feedback that it doesn't fit with this journal. And at other times, when we've had peer review comments that we disagree with, and for good reason, not that I just feel angry and frustrated that I got it so badly wrong, but sometimes I think the peer reviewers maybe haven't understood the paper, then I've engaged in a discussion with the editor, with the senior editor for a journal, and said, well, can you look at this again? Sometimes that doesn't work. One quite sort of important example for me when it did work was when I submitted a paper early on in my career to Addiction, which is one of the leading journals in the field, and it got sent back saying, we don't think this is a good paper for this journal. And I wrote a letter to the editor. At that time was Griffith Edwards, very important senior figure in the field. And I thought, well, that would be the end of it. But a few weeks later, I got a telephone call at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. I was still in bed. And I picked up the phone and I just woke up and the person at the other end said, it's Griffith Edwards here. And he spoke like that. And I got the biggest shock of my life because he's a very well-known figure. How did he get my telephone number? Why was he phoning me at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday? Why am I stood here without any clothes on talking to Griffith Edwards? It was completely bizarre. But he wanted to talk to me about what I'd written. And he wanted to have a dialogue. He liked to talk to people. And I got a relationship with him that way. And eventually the paper was accepted. So there are lots of, my experience is that there isn't one approach, there isn't one easy way, but there are lots of different things. But be resilient. That's the important thing. I was really pleased to bump into Amador just outside. Amador Calafat is the editor of Ediciones that Michal mentioned in his talk, one of the most important European journals in the field of addiction. Publishes in not in English, so lots of the challenges that we were talking about are relevant, and persuaded Amador to come and join the panel.
Thank you. So, but we will also publish in English some of them. The name of the journal is Ediciones, and I have been 26 years the editor. Okay, I will start with the resilience. Resilience is very important in our field, but also is not an infinite variable, so you have to look at it. And I will think that the question of publication takes time and energy, so you should have a strategy, and this strategy has to be successful. So it means that from the beginning you must know if you want to go to the highest impact, but this maybe will have a price for you, and maybe you are just interested in publishing in a way, in a good paper, in a good journal, sorry. So the thing is that, of course, David is in a better position than all of us in publishing, so he can have Griffith Edwards calling him on Sunday, but this will not happen to most of us. So the thing is, I will think that you have before start writing, you have to know to which journals you are going to send the paper, because especially if you are not an English native, this takes time and you have to change the whole structure. This It's not only time, sometimes it's also money. So, and you have to think not only in addiction journals, you have you have to think our prevention journal, you have to think, because, for example, only the 20% of the production in addictions is published in addiction journals, so you have to think in other. The second thing is that I will start thinking in journals that have a very quick review process, because sometimes, especially if the journals, even in some important journals, goes through some troubles, you can wait for half a year and nearly a year for and this is terrible, because just after a year or half a year or even 4 months you receive a feedback and you have to start again. So this is terrible. So the good thing is to start for a journal that have a good review. You must know your resilience, how much can afford, and I think that most of it is important to be published, even if it's not the best one. And published not in any journal. Impact factor is important, but a journal that maybe is in the certain in base in Medline, in Scopus, this sort of thing, that you know that people will get at you. Okay, so I will think that this is important. There was other things going on, because I think that in the process, I think you must know the sort of paper you have in your hand, because some papers are very important, you know that, and some papers are not so important. They are just, you have some data, you have been working on them, and you think it can be a good publication. So the strategy has to change, and you have to be very flexible into this real world, because and finally I will think that editors receive a lot of papers, so in a way your paper has to be formally very, especially if you are a foreigner, or you have even you are not a foreigner, the first author has a foreign, a non-English, so if you are not very good in everything, they will just reject you, because they don't want to go through the process of telling you formal things and not, because the editor is a very busy person. Sometimes he doesn't receive a compensation, an economic compensation for doing his work, so he wants things done very quickly, so he will not just look to the important thing you are saying, also to the formal things. So I think this is quite important. So the resume, that the abstract is of course very important. You have, because sometimes the abstract is done at the last moment, and that's very, and the title, you have to impress the editor in a way. He has to know that has something important, and you have to express very precisely in the resume. Sometimes only the resume is the only thing they are going to read. The editor, and of course people get into the basis. Okay, that's my contribution.
Very useful. Thank you.
So, my name is Rosaria Galanti. I'm a professor in epidemiology at Karolinska Institutet. And I can make a long story short, because my experience is exactly the same that David says. I can understand most of the things you said. I'm still struggling with most of these issues. I would like to take up 2 topics from this. My presentation is very short. I've been publishing for quite a number of years right now. A couple of topics. One is the choice of the journal, and I want to add just one piece, one angle view to these things that have already been said. Often the choice of the journal, high impact, low impact, medium impact, how to bargain between speed of the process and impact factor or ambitions, depend on a number of factors. I'm trying to list the most important ones. One is the novelty of the topics, of course, and the field you are applying it to. But there is an important actor in all this scenario, that we are like to overlook if we don't bring it up explicitly, which is your university and your research group and your department. What are they saying? What message are they conveying? For instance, in the Karolinska Institutet, we have a big pressure on us to publish in high impact factors journals. The new strategy for the Karolinska Institute for the coming years is less is more. Less papers, but higher ranking. So this gives us just a, it's a strong message we get. We cannot always comply with this, but this is the. So if we ignore this kind of input, we might end up, in a situation where we cannot decide. So we know now that we have to publish less, possibly, but better. Beforehand was not like this, was a little bit more relaxed. So that being in fields where we know, I agree with you, that the impact factor cannot exceed a certain value. For instance, in public health, you seldom can publish in journals that have an impact factor higher than 5. You are very happy if you end up in epidemiology or things like this. So this is a very strong, and in the field of addiction also. I mean, the highest impact factors I know is around 4 or 5. Yeah. So that's a very important thing to consider. It depends on what your institution is really putting focus on. But in general, why not to try for the highest you can conceive your message for, and then go down in ambitions. Often, by the way, the highest is also the one that has, not always, the most speedy process. Rejection time for BMJ is 1 week. So, after 1 week, so this is one. The second thing I wanted to bring up that's not being brought up is the what I call the kill your darling syndrome, which has to do with the length of the paper and how many message and how much should I cut. Still, I don't have the answer, but I found in my career very useful to mingle with journalists. I mean now, not scientific journalists, I mean journalists. And they taught me 2 things. One, you have to have a story. So keep to the story. Try to figure out what's the story that you want to tell. And try to figure out, they taught me this eye technique. You figure out, not only a title, you figure out, I don't know in journalist terms what's called in English, this, short resume that you have under a title, often in chronicles. Mother kills baby 18 months or whatever. This is a sad story in Stockholm or whatever it is. So try to figure out what's your story, brief story, and then build your paper around that story, not the other way around. So that was the suggestion that people gave me, and I found it still useful, even if I don't comply always with this thing. But just to add the funny story to the editor story, I'm always very well dressed when editors when editors interact with me for some reason. I don't know. No, not well dressed, but dressed. One of the sad stories I have to funny and sad at the same time. I have to. It was the same journal, the same journal that David was talking about. I had a peer review from this journal for one of my articles that was, in my opinion, clearly, completely flowed by personal interests. So one of the peer reviewers, I could identify him from the speech. I mean, we are very few in the field, so wanted, the other one was very positive. This particular one was very negative from the beginning, but it allowed us to reply, and then at the second round, he strongly opposed to the publication of the paper. And I know that he has personal interests to reject the paper. So I wrote to the editor and I said, listen, I suspect that there is a conflict of interest here. And strangely enough, we were mail messaging each other, and the editor said, I suspected it too, but what can I do? So the paper was rejected, but the editor became very friendly with me, and eventually he invited me to publish together another paper. So that's you can end up in a situation like this, but never give up and try to contact the editor always, even in case you say, okay, there is no chance.
Just a couple of reflections. I like your story, your anecdotes, really, really nice. But these anecdotes probably reflect fairly unusual one-off situations. Most of the time, when I get peer-reviewed comments, they're really helpful, and it makes me realise that actually I should take on board what the peer reviewers have said. I should use them to make the paper better. This is a week or so later after I've got over my initial sort of...
No, it's true.
Yeah. So most of the time, the mechanism works. It's really good, and take on board what the peer reviewers say. The second point is to do with the clarity of the paper, and reducing it down from a 20,000 thesis or report to maybe a 3,000 or 4,000 word report. And the idea of getting rid of a lot of material can be quite hard, but it's so important, and you have to be ruthless. You have to take away a lot of the stuff that you think is important, but it's just essentially background information that isn't essential to the story, to the key message. So you do have to be ruthless, and that is a skill that develops, and I see it more often in early career researchers than in more senior people when I'm doing peer reviews, for example. But certainly there is a tendency with early career researchers to try and put everything in there, and stop. Don't do it. Take out some stuff. Keep it nice and clean, and it will be a better paper for it.
Can I just ask, is it better to start with lots and cut it down, or just have more of a focus to start with? My professor said cutting your own work was like beating your own child. You can't do it. So
well, people are different, aren't they? My PhD supervisor had what he called a generative model of writing, in that he would get absolutely everything down and then cut, and that worked for him. And I tend to follow that approach, although I guess with experience I take shortcuts now, in that I get everything down and then straight away I'll throw something away, rather than leaving it for a couple of weeks and coming back to it and then taking something away. But some people I know, but this is perhaps a little bit rarer, are able to be very clear and concise right from the very beginning. They don't have that generative model of writing. The other thing I would say as well is try not to make your paper 100% perfect. Get it to about 85 or 90% and then send it for peer review, because that last 15% takes months and it will take forever. It's like writing your PhD thesis. If you try to make it perfect before you let anybody see it, it will take forever. Get it to around about 85 or 90%, and then show it to other people, whether it's your supervisor, whether it's a journal.
Your worst enemy.
Your worst enemy.
Is a very good thing. People are very critical. Just can add one thing to this generative contra monogamic approach in writing. Did you ever hear the expression one paper, one question? This is the way we try. So my perception is that you end up with too much stuff in any case, but if you start by approaching a paper by asking yourself, what's the question this paper should address? Are children of alcoholics more depressed at age 5? This is a question. Than people of non-alcoholics, of course. This is a question. A question should not, what's depression like among alcoholics and children of alcoholics and non-alcoholics? Then it becomes a very unmanageable question. And you, from the beginning, have too much stuff. You end up with too much stuff in any case, I promise you. Because we are used to make a lot of analysis that we then don't publish. So try to think in terms one paper, one question. The question should be very operative.
I was wondering about more the statistical things because, for example, you see that assumptions are hardly ever written about in papers and stuff. For example, I did attrition analysis for my bachelor thesis, which I hope to get published someday. But I'm not sure should I leave it out, but because it does strengthen the research, the quality of the research. So I was wondering about how should you include those, or should you let them out because they're not really focused on the story or the question you're trying to answer, or yeah, that was a bit what I was thinking about.
Can you summarize your attrition analysis in 2 or 3 sentences?
Probably, yeah.
That's what you would normally see in a paper as part of the method or early on in the results, depending on the journal style.
Yeah.
Some journals now allow you to submit additional material because they can archive this online. It's cheap to do that. But usually for these sorts of additional quality type of analyses, such as an attrition analysis, it's summarized in 2 sentences, 3 sentences.
And by the way, the same is true, coming to that, also for the extension of the background, which is always a trouble. How much should I write in the background? How much is discussion? How much citation should I have? I mean, first of all, the background of a paper is not a systematic review. So remember that. If you want to write a systematic review on a topic, then you write a systematic review, and then you have 100 papers. But the background should be, in some journals, it depends on the style of the journals, some journals they accept a long background. In the medical journals, usually the background is very, very short. It should be useful to highlight the topic, the so-called niche of the topic you want to publish on. So if you are publishing on children of alcoholics, you should have in the background the citation, the extension that allow you to explain why your paper is important in this context, not everything on children of alcoholics. Because then you write a systematic review. That's another thing.
So this answers the question, how can I be sure that I don't miss nothing?
Yeah, exactly.
So
you don't have to bother to not miss. People know you're not writing a systematic review.
Okay.
You are highlighting the most important things in this topic that has been done is this. Often you can cite a review instead of 100 papers. But this topic has not been highlighted. But from this point of view, my contribution is this. This is more or less the extension of the background. And then, as I said, some papers want to have a long story, some papers want to have a short story, but the essence is not, the background is not a systematic review. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you write another kind of thing.
Sorry?
Only just short comment. If we are speaking about review and about category, original writing or systematic review, I would like to repeat again the fact that the highest number of papers or manuscripts are expelled not because of content, but because of formal things. It means that there is no starting of peer review. It means that it was expelled before. and not because of content, but because of instructions of the journal. For instance, you have a limited number of figures, limited number of citations, and if you are author and send a young author and send the manuscript into the journal, and maximum are 40 citations, and you have 42, you finished. If maximum are 5 tables and you have 6 tables, finished. It means that if you would like to open peer review and to be under peer review, there is necessary to go through the first gatekeeper, and I mean that editors selected this paper before, and there is necessary to really strictly follow instructions, and especially if you write a systematic review, you have to follow structure. You have to follow all instructions, because, for instance, for systematic review, you have maximum 60 citations, not only 30, like for original writings, and if you don't follow it, you lost.
I hate to cut it short. We have run over lunchtime a little bit. So, any final points from panelists? David?
There was just one point. One of the questions was about how do I know that that I've got everything which is important in the field in the introduction that I have, and sometimes you don't. I mean, if you're working in the field, you should have pretty good knowledge, and therefore you should be pretty confident that you've covered the material in the introduction, albeit concisely. But occasionally a peer reviewer will make a suggestion and say that, have you considered this reference? That happens to me on an occasional basis. Peer reviewer will say, you missed this work, and you think, crikey, I should have got that. And you feel a bit sort of down for a bit, but then after a week you look at it, okay, let's make it better. Let's put it in the paper, if you agree. Let's put it in the paper.
Yeah. Sometimes you can even understand that the reviewer is one of the author of the paper he is or she is suggesting, but it's all right. If you deem that was an important piece of information, why not? It's,
just to finish. I will think that nowadays there are fashions, and in this moment to write very short introductions is a fashion. And it's not a fashion, but it's very important, the statistics. I mean, some journals, they only look to the statistics and they don't mind about other things, or they mind in a second, so especially at high level. But what I will stress is this idea that you have to count a story, to tell a history. And so from the beginning, the title, the introduction is just to prepare the person and for what are you going to tell. And what is important is the discussion, because finally, especially I don't know the reviewer, but finally, more than the results, that is more the statistics specialist, but finally the discussion has to be very well prepared, and you have to convince, and you have to tell a history. That's very important.